2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, is this thing working? Okay. You can hear me? Yeah, well, I got a nod or two back. Mary's nodding, so maybe we're up and running here. We are in Luke chapter 14 today. I'm going to talk about an incident that happened one Sabbath day when Jesus was invited to a Pharisee's house, and he opted to go. Now, I do have a handout, and there's a couple guys that are passing them out, so if you didn't get one, if you kind of look around, I think Tim may have put the last of them in this chair back here, so if you did not grab one, sneak back here and grab one out of that chair, that'd be good. Humility. It's a difficult concept to understand, and it's especially difficult to apply to our lives. And Jesus was dealing with a lot of hard-headed religious folks during his time, so he spoke a lot about humility and about how his disciples needed to be humble. And this little section of Luke emphasizes the wisdom that can be found in a humble life. Jesus was the perfect example of humility. And certainly in John chapter 13, when he washes the disciples' feet, that was a demonstration of that humility. But beyond that, of course, his going to the cross was the ultimate in humility. He was God, and yet he put away everything that it was to be God, became a human, and lived here on this earth. Lived here like you and I, except without sin, and went to the cross just for us, as Blake pointed out in his lesson this morning. You know, when you get an invitation, there are some things that are wrapped up in an invitation. It's called proper etiquette. You know, an invitation, it should be viewed as being sincere. When you get that invitation, somebody sincerely wants you to come to their dinner, to come to their party, to come to the occasion of whatever it is. It's a sincere invitation. So the host actually desires my presence, and I need to regard it that way. They regard my presence. And I shouldn't ignore the invitation, especially if there's an RSVP attached. I need to contact the host and let them know, yes, sir, indeed, I plan to attend. I'll be there. And maybe there'll be one or two more with me, whatever the case may be. My response to the invitation should also be just as genuine as the issuer of the invitation was genuine. And I should appreciate the fact that I've been invited. But not only that, my presence and my behavior should reflect my gratitude. And I think that's part of what Jesus is getting to when he deals with these individuals on this particular occasion. Typically, when we have a party, dinner party or whatever kind of party, we invite family, at least close family, and our good friends, right? We tend to stick with folks who are kind of in our same socioeconomic level. You know, we don't reach too far above, we don't reach too far below. And Jesus has a few things to say about that when he's addressing this. But we tend to issue invitations to those that'll probably repay us. You know, there's kind of an understanding there. If you have dinner at my house, then you're going to offer me dinner at your house at some, I mean, it's not like the next week or the next day or something like that, but it's kind of just an understood I owe you kind of thing. So we tend to invite people that we would expect an invitation from. Now, verse 1 here says, on one Sabbath, Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee. He was being carefully watched. Jesus knew everywhere he went, everything he did, he was being watched. Some watched him to see what he would do, to learn from him, and to hear from him, and to grow as a result. Others watched him to see what they could find to trap him, to blame him, to accuse him, and that was certainly what was happening on this particular Sabbath at this particular individual's house. He is said to be a Pharisee, so you know his political leaning already. He has a lot of traditions that he would like to bind on other people. Part of being a Pharisee. It also says he is a prominent Pharisee, so that could mean that he is wealthy, that he's part of the Sanhedrin. Perhaps he is a rabbi. Perhaps he is a scribe or a lawyer. Scribes and lawyers, those are interchangeable terms. But maybe he's all of that. You know, maybe he is not only a Pharisee, but he is also a member of the Sanhedrin. That's the 70 ruling like elders. And he is a rabbi and he's a scribe. He could be all of that. Don't really know. But for some reason, Luke identifies him as a prominent Pharisee. So he's being watched. Jesus knows men's hearts. John 2:24 and 25 states there that Jesus didn't trust anybody because he knew men's hearts. He knew just how deceitful we were. He just knew how we were out to catch him if we could. He knows men. So he was never caught off guard. As a matter of fact, while people are judging him, Jesus is also judging them, as will become evident in what he has to say when things are coming about here. If you think about it, he was actually the most dangerous person in the world to sit next to, right? Because he's going to correct you. And he doesn't correct actions so much as he corrects hearts. He is more interested in your thoughts and your desires than he is in particular actions, which is just the reverse of what the Pharisees were involved with. They were busy worrying about actions, especially actions that would violate their traditions. So the very first thing that happens in verse 2, there in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. Jesus asked the Pharisees and the experts of the law, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Okay, so this guy is suffering from a disease. We don't know the specifics of it, but as I understand it, it was a situation that either related to heart or kidney or liver, or perhaps all three, that would cause fluid to accumulate in your tissues. And so the tissues would become swollen, and it was often painful. It was difficult to deal with, and of course they don't have medicines that we have today that could help people eliminate that fluid buildup. And it was curable only if the condition that caused it was cured. But of course, you don't have to worry about that with Jesus. So this guy would not have been invited to the party, okay? The Pharisee would not have invited him to the party. Nobody else would have thought, well, let's bring this guy along as part of the party. That would not happen. This guy was a trap. He was bait. And he was brought there specifically to trap Jesus. But Jesus knows men's hearts. And Jesus knew the trap. So the situation is, if I don't heal him, then I'm regarded as callous and cold, and I don't care about the suffering of people. And yet, if I do heal him, the Pharisees are going to get all bent out of shape because I'm doing something like this on the Sabbath. So Jesus does what? Well, he just flips the tables. It was my dilemma. Now it's yours. What's he say? Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Now they can say, no, you can't heal him on the Sabbath. And they are regarded as cold and heartless, and they don't care about people. Or they could say, well, sure, you need to heal him because you have that ability. In which case, they would be underscoring or improving or endorsing work on the Sabbath, which was definitely against their own beliefs. So what do? What they normally do, they say nothing. We just pretend like you didn't say anything. That just went right over our heads. We didn't catch that at all. Say nothing. Huh? Yeah. Duh. I don't know. They remained silent. So, taking hold of the man, Jesus healed him and sent him away. But Jesus is not going to let it lay there. He's not going to leave him alone. He comes right back with, then he asked them, if one of you has a son or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out? There's the dilemma again. He knew good and well they would. Every one of them would. And getting a donkey or an ox out of a well is not something you can do by yourself. It's not. You and about 10 of your friends maybe, you and a small army maybe, but you alone are not going to get an ox out of a well. Now maybe if your son fell in there, you could get your son out by yourself, maybe. But you're not getting an ox out by, that's work. Boy, you talk about work, that's serious work. And Jesus knew good and well they would do that. But their response is nothing, dead silence. They're not going to jump into that one. You know, there are at least 7 occasions that I found where Jesus violated the Sabbath traditions. He did not violate the Sabbath. As he points out, he is the Lord of the Sabbath. And as he also pointed out, the Sabbath was created for man, not man for the Sabbath. He violated their traditions. In Luke chapter 4, 31 through 37, he cast out a demon on the Sabbath. And Luke 4, picking up right there, 38 through 39, he healed a fever on the Sabbath. I believe that was Peter's mother-in-law. He also allowed his disciples to pick grain on the Sabbath, in Luke 6, 1 through 5. He healed a lame man on the Sabbath, in John 5, 1 through 9. He healed a man with a paralyzed hand in Luke 6, 6 through 10. He also delivered a crippled woman who was afflicted with a demon, Luke 13, 10 through 17. And he also healed a man that was born blind in John 9. He was not only born blind, but he had been blind for a long, long time. He was a full adult at this point. I don't remember, I had written out to the side, you find out in chapter 10 just exactly how old he was, but he's a full-grown man by the time Jesus heals him. So as Jesus then takes care of this situation, he turns his attention to what's going on in the room. And he notices that people are picking places of honor at the table. Now, it's traditional, I guess, to have a seating arrangement for your dinner kind of thing. And if you're having a party, a lot of times, if there are official guests there, you might even have like a head table. And you would assign seats at that head table, right? And then other people would sit at various tables around the room. A lot of times, you want to be close to the front. You maybe even want to be close to that head table. Or you'd love it if you were sitting at that head table, right? And Jesus is noting these people, and they're trying to pick out positions of honor. So they want to sit near the host. The host is probably going to sit, if we use a table, there would be a head of the table, and the host would probably be sitting at the head of the table, and then others would sit around that table. From what I understand, folks are kind of laying around the food here. And so if you're like center of this particular little couch that you're on, you're at the number 1 spot. And then the folks that are moving out from that, they're at the next level. And then, of course, the cushion or whatever it is that's next to that one on either side, and you work out from there. So these guys are trying to pick out their spots, and Jesus notices this. And he says, when someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say, give your place to this man. Then you're humiliated because you will have to take the least important place. But when you're invited, take the lowly place so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of your fellow guest, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself will be exalted. Status symbols, right? We have them. You drive the right car. You live in the right neighborhood. You hang out with the right people. You wear the right clothes. You attend the right school. I mean, whatever it is, that checks all those little boxes, that's how we identify status now. Well, for them, it was getting invitations to these soirees. It was getting invited to somebody's house. It was sitting in the more important places within that gathering. So it was an outward appearance thing versus an inward heart kind of thing. The emphasis was on reputation and not on character. Now, Jesus tells them, when you go into one of these situations, you don't go grab the number one spot. Because what's going to happen if somebody comes in who has a higher standing than you? Well, then you're going to be royally embarrassed, because the host is going to come to you and say, hey, David, you need to give up this seat because, and right? And then all the other seats are taken except the very lowliest seat, and you're going to be embarrassed to have to get up from the number one seat next to the host and have to move to what's left, which of course would be the very last seat, the furthest away from the host, and you really are royally embarrassed when you do that. So Jesus says, the better thing for you to do is to pick a seat in the middle, a lower seat. And then when your host comes in and says, oh, David, no, you need to come up a little closer to me. Then you are honored in front of everybody else because you get to move up. So it's just a simple little thing that he says, but he also points out that God humbles the proud, but he exalts the humble. And it refers to James 4:6, where it says that. And also that he sees thoughts and motives, 1 Samuel 16:7, where he points out to Samuel that, man looks at the outside, God looks at the heart when he's choosing someone to work for him. So, Jesus also then addresses the whole party idea itself. He says in verse 12, he said to his host, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or relatives or rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and you will have been repaid. See, it's kind of like we were talking about earlier. You have an invitation, you go, and then you incur kind of an unspoken debt that you would repay that kindness and invite them. Well, Jesus is saying, why are you doing that? Now, he's not saying, as it appears, he's not saying don't invite your friends, your brothers, your relatives, your rich neighbors. He's actually saying don't only invite your friends, your brothers, your relatives, your rich neighbors. A statement similar to this is in John chapter 6, where Jesus says, do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life. What it actually says there is do not work only for food that spoils. Of course you're going to work for food so that you can eat and so that you can live. Don't only work for food that spoils, but for food that endures. Similarly, in 1 Corinthians 1:17, Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Well, he did not send me only to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Okay? Because, of course, Paul, as a matter of fact, he will go on to say in that very situation, I have baptized this person, and this family, and that kind of thing. So, yes, baptism was included. But what he's saying is not only to baptize, but rather to preach the gospel. Similarly, in 1 Timothy 5:23, where Paul tells Timothy, stop drinking water, but drink a little wine. No, what he's saying is don't drink only water, but rather add some wine because you got a stomach issue, you need to treat it. So that's what he's saying here. Don't just invite your friends, your brothers, your relatives, your rich neighbors. If you do, they're going to invite you back, then you're repaid. Rather, when you get a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Why? Because they can't repay. There's no debt incurred there. They can't invite you back. Jesus went to several places to eat. There again, I found several. Matthew 8, he went to Peter's house. In Matthew 9, he went to Matthew's house. In Luke 19, he went to Zacchaeus' house. In John 11 and 12, he went to Martha, Mary, and Lazarus' house. I think the house is actually identified as Martha's house. And Matthew 26, he was at Simon the leper's house. So it's not unusual for Jesus to go to these lunches or dinners. And he certainly was not going to repay, not at least in the physical sense. But he says then, but when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteousness. So you're going to be repaid. The question is, do you want your repayment now, or do you want your repayment later? Most of us, I think, would like our repayment later. It's similar to when Jesus says, when you pray, don't stand out there in the streets and draw attention from everybody else, but rather go into your closet, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. Don't you want that one? Well, I do, because that has heaven written all over it. This has heaven written all over it too. You will be repaid at the resurrection. He would point out in James 2:5 that it is the poor in the eyes of the world that are rich in faith and will inherit the kingdom. We want to be part of that. Jesus challenged his host and his followers to extend hospitality to those who need it the most, those who would not be regarded highly. When one of those at the table heard him say this, he says to Jesus, "Blessed is the man who will eat at the feast of the kingdom." So he picked up on that little part right there at the end, probably, be prayed at the resurrection of the righteous. And he's like, oh yeah, there's going to be a feast. When we take over, there's going to be a feast in that new kingdom. I want to be part of that. Blessed are they that eat at this table. Well, I don't really know if he was trying to distract everybody from what Jesus has just said, because he probably regarded what Jesus said as an insult to the host, or if he sincerely is moving on into this deal about the resurrection of the just. The Jewish people pictured a future kingdom as a great feast with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the prophets as the honored guest. And this anonymous guest was confident that he would be part of the ones that were eating in that kingdom. Sometimes we can get caught up in that too. We can make the same mistake that these individuals made by overlooking folks that really are searching for God, really are looking for God, really want to know the truth of God's Word, because we want to find people that are like us, right? And we overlook folks that would gladly come. Blake made mention of the fact that we shouldn't just love just those that love us. Matter of fact, the Bible tells us we are to love God, and then secondly, we are to love our neighbor, right? We have to love ourselves, because the Bible says you're to love your neighbor as yourself. So you must love yourself. And we are to love one another. Over and over again, we're told to love one another. Jesus says, people will know that you love me by the way you love one another. They'll know you're my disciples by the love that you have one for another. We're also told to love our neighbor, and we're also told to love our enemies. So Jesus goes into another parable then. He says, a certain man prepared a great banquet, invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servants to tell those who had been invited to come, for everything now is ready. And Jesus makes a similar parable in Matthew chapter 22, where he talks about a king giving a wedding feast for his son. Details are not exact. They're totally different, as a matter of fact, but it's similar. So it's something that you might want to pay attention to. In those days, kind of like we do today, there was an invitation sent out. The invitation was sent out, and there was a reply that came back. So everybody that got an invitation and had replied to that invitation now knew the day that this feast was going to take place. And they have agreed, I will be there on that day. They don't know the exact time. The exact time is kind of fluctuating depending on when all the preparations are being made and it's done. But they know the day, and they've already marked it down, so they're prepared, and they have told the host, I'm coming. So the host now knows the number of people that are coming to his party. The host can direct how many sheep are slaughtered, how many goats are slaughtered, how much chicken and dumplings are prepared, all the parties, all the wine, all the desserts, everything is made ready for that particular day. And when the time is right, he sends his servants out to tell his guests that have already told him they're coming to come to the party. But what happens? They all alike began to make excuses. The first, I have just bought a field. I must go and see it. Please excuse me. Another said, I have just bought 5 yoke of oxen. I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me. Still another, I just got married, so I can't come. Well, what's your impression? They don't like the guy very much. Yeah, that's kind of it too. No, they obviously don't like the guy very much, but also they lied. They've lied. I mean, Jesus is throwing some things out there that really, these are blatant lies. You know that. Nobody buys a field without looking at it. Have you ever bought a piece of property without looking at it? No. No, you may find out you got swampland. You know, you don't buy a piece of property without looking at it. You ever bought a car without driving it? Some people may have in this day and age. I don't know, they buy it online. But most of us will not buy a car without trying it out. For the folks that are in this socioeconomic strata, a wedding is a big deal. A wedding, just like this party, is announced in advance. A wedding, just like this party, preparation is made well in advance. Some of these parties lasted for a week. This guy did not just get married. He didn't. He knew well in advance when he was getting married. He also knew his wife wasn't coming to this party. So when he accepted, he knew good and well he was accepting for himself on this particular day, at this particular time, I just got married is not an excuse. Now, Deuteronomy will tell the Jews, you know, you don't have to serve in the military, and there are certain financial obligations you don't have to have if you just got married. That's like up for the first year. But it has nothing to do with social obligations. These folks lied. And they're blatant lies, and that's why Jesus used these excuses, because the people that are listening to him know good and well these are lousy excuses. They're lies. And they reflect, as was pointed out, they really don't like the guy. They really don't like the host. Which Roy, that's even worse when you think, Jesus is talking about God here. Yeah, Jesus is talking about God here. The prophets have gone out and they have said, the kingdom of God is coming. Now, God's servant is on the scene and he says, the kingdom of heaven is here. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. And these folks are making excuses for why they don't want to follow Jesus, why they do not want to listen to his invitation. And in John 14, verse 6, we know he is the way, the truth, the life. Nobody comes to the Father but by him. This kingdom that the prophets have talked about, this banquet in the sky that the prophets have told is coming, Jesus says, it's here now, I am it. And yet, they make excuses. They look for ways to get around what he's saying. The servant comes back to the master and reports all this, and the master gets some kind of angry. And he says, you go out and you find people in the streets and you invite them. Why is he doing that? Well, he has done slaughtered 100 sheep. He has prepared all this food. The table is set. The band is playing. Everything is ready. All I need is people. And he says, you go out and find people that want to eat. You go out and find people that want to come to my house and have a meal. And then he comes back and he says, well, we've already done that and there's still room. And he says, go into the hedges, go into the alleyways. You check everywhere and you bring people in. My house will be full. But nobody that received an invitation will eat one morsel from my table. Which really should scare the life out of every one of us. It should scare the very life out of those Pharisees that were listening to him that day. Because the message is, God is reaching out to those who love him, those who want him, those who are willing to listen to him and do what he says. He says, all things are ready. Come to the feast. And we start making stupid excuses like these guys, God will say, move on. Move on. Get me somebody else. I want people that want to be here. I want people that want to be in my house. I want people that want to eat my food. Should scare the life out of every one of us. And you know what? It's not what we expect, and it's certainly not what they expected. It's the outcast, it's the loiterers, it's the homeless, it's the undesirable, but it's the kind of people Jesus came to save. In Luke 15, tax collectors and sinners were gathered around to hear Jesus speak, and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And of course, the whole deal is, who else would he be eating with, right? There's nobody else on this earth. So, of course, he's got sinners around him. We all are. In Luke 19:10, the Son of Man came to seek and save that which was lost. And in Luke 5, a Levi was giving a big reception for Jesus in his house, and there was a great crowd of tax collectors there. Makes sense. That's who he worked with. Other people were also reclining at the table, and the Pharisees and scribes were grumbling at his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "It is not those who are well that need a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners to repentance." We need to remember that too. Jesus wants everybody. The call is made for everybody. I gave you a couple verses to look at there in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, also in Romans chapter 5. But God's kingdom is for everybody who wants Jesus as number one, who is willing to listen to him, willing to follow him, willing to obey him. Love God and love our fellow man. Thank you very much for your attention today. Next week, we are going to zip over to Matthew, I think. Yeah, Matthew chapter 13. No, I take that back. Stay here in Luke 14, starting in verse 25. We'll get the rest of the chapter. Yay. That way I can back up, cover a point or two that I might not have made strong enough right now. Thanks again for your attention. Luke chapter 14, continuing on next week. Then we'll go to Matthew 13 after that.